The year is 1879. The sky over Dry Willow Pass had turned the color of a bad bruise. It started not with rain, but with a silence that felt heavier than thunder. The air, thick with the smell of pine and dust, grew cold enough to raise the hair on a man's arms. Then came the first stone. It struck the canvas top of Eliza Hart's wagon with a sharp crack, like a knuckle on a dry bone. Another followed, then a dozen, then a torrent. The noise wasn't a drumming, it was a furious, constant shattering, inside the rocking confines of the wagon. Eliza Hart pressed herself into the corner, making herself small. Her world had shrunk to the smell of damp canvas and the hard, familiar edges of the heavy oak chest she cradled in her lap. It held everything she was, needles fine as a mosquito's sting, spools of thread in 50 colors, shears that could cut through leather, and half-finished lace that felt like a spider's dream. The world outside could break, but this chest had to survive. Dust, shaken loose from every seam of the wagon, mixed with the tears of pure, helpless frustration in her eyes, forming a gritty paste on her cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear of the storm, but from the terrifying lurch and groan of the left rear wheel. It was a sound that spoke of failure, of being stranded, of an end. Outside. Luke Harrow fought his horses. The reins felt like they were slicing his palms raw, the wet leather slipping and biting. His 2 pack horses, tethered behind his gelding, sidestepped and pulled, their eyes white with panic as thunder finally broke overhead. A sound so deep it seemed to come from the granite rock of the pass itself. The hail hammered his hat, stung his shoulders through his thick duster. He kept his own horse steady, murmuring low words that were swallowed by the wind, his body a tense line of control against the chaos. He saw the wagon ahead, tilted at a dangerous angle. It was sliding, inch by agonizing inch, toward the jagged edge of the pass. The driver, a hired hand from the last town, had already jumped clear, now cowering under a rock outcropping like a frightened rabbit. Useless. Only the woman was left, with a final curse at the storm. Luke urged his gelding forward, forcing the animal into the narrow space between the teetering wagon and the sheer rock face. The air was a maelstrom of ice and wind. He could feel the panic coming off the wagon's horses in waves, their stamping hooves churning the muddy track into a slick mess. He had to get them unhitched before they dragged the whole rig over the side. He swung down from his saddle, his boots sinking into the mud. The hail was larger now, the size of acorns, hitting his back with a force that made him grunt. He kept his head low, moving with a practiced economy of motion. His knife was in his hand, slicing through the thick leather traces. One horse broke free, then the other, bolting down the pass toward the dubious safety of Brim Hollow below. Luke let them go. They weren't his problem. The wagon was... He got his first clear look at her then, a face framed by the wagon's opening, pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyes were wide, but not with the vacant terror he'd seen in others. There was a fierce, intelligent light in them, a desperate calculating. She was watching the wheel. Luke followed her gaze. The wheel wobbled violently, its iron rim screeching against the axle pin. The linchpin was gone, vibrated loose on the rough trail, and the whole assembly was about to slide off the axle. The wagon gave another deep groan and shifted, the wood of the axle complaining under the strain. "It's the axle box," she yelled, her voice thin but clear against the wind. It's working loose, Luke didn't need to be told. He saw the gap, a fatal space between the hub of the wheel and the axle arm where the retaining flange should have been tight. The whole weight of the wagon was pushing the wheel outward. He scanned the ground, his eyes darting through the curtain of falling ice. He needed a wedge, something hard. His eyes landed on a piece of fallen pine, a stout branch thick as his wrist, lying near the rock wall. He grabbed it, and in the same motion, pulled the small hatchet from his belt. Bracing the wood against a rock, he began to hack at it, the blade sending chips of pale wood flying into the storm. He worked with a brutal focus, ignoring the hail that beat on his knuckles, turning them white and numb. He was shaping a thick, tapered shim, a temporary fix born of desperation. Inside. Eliza watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the raw competence in his hands, the way he moved as if the storm were merely an inconvenience, not an apocalypse. He was not a large man, but he was built of wire and leather, every movement serving a purpose. She could see the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his wet shirt as he worked the hatchet. For a moment, she forgot the failing wagon, mesmerized by the sheer, stubborn will of the man. He finished the wedge and turned back to the wheel. "I need to get this in deep," he shouted, pointing toward the gap. "It has to hold against the hub." He knelt in the mud, positioning the pointed end of the wedge into the space. He had nothing to use as a hammer but a flat rock. It was awkward. The wagon shifted again, the wheel groaning as it slipped another inch. It was almost off. "No, that won't do it," Eliza cried out. The words were ripped from her throat. Her control, so tightly held, was finally snapping. All her miles, all her work, all the running from a life she didn't want, was about to end up in a splintered heap at the bottom of a canyon because of one small pin. The wagon wasn't just wood and canvas to her, it was her life, her independence. If it went, she broke with it. She leaned as far out as she dared, her voice raw with a desperate, frantic urgency. "Get it inside, shove it inside me, or I'll break, I swear I'll break." The words flew out into the storm. For the briefest of moments, Luke froze, his head snapped up, and his eyes met hers. In that fraction of a second, the world narrowed, the howl of the wind, the crash of the hail, it all fell away. He saw her face, the rain and tears cutting paths through the dust on her cheeks, her lips parted, her eyes blazing with an intensity that had nothing to do with the wheel. He was a man of the West, a man who had spent long nights in rough towns and heard coarse talk in saloons. The words she screamed, taken out of the context of the groaning axle and the sliding wood, landed in his mind with a jarring, unintended meaning. A flash of something confusion, shock, an echo of a world far from this cold rock crossed his features. Then, just as quickly, his gaze dropped back to the wheel, to her hand pointing frantically at the axle box, and understanding dawned. She didn't mean him. She meant the wedge, inside the frame, inside the gap, to save the wagon, to save her. The heat that had risen in his neck vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He threw the rock aside. It was too slow. "Brace yourself," he roared. He positioned the wedge again, then drove his shoulder into the flat end of it, using his own body as a ram. His back and legs coiled, and he pushed with every ounce of his strength. The muscles in his back screamed in protest. The wet wood was slick. His boots slipped in the mud. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a shriek of tortured wood, the wedge began to move. He could feel it biting, forcing its way into the gap, pushing the heavy wheel back toward the axle arm. The wagon shuddered. Eliza cried out, a sound that was half sob, half cheer. Again she urged, her voice cracking. Luke reset himself and pushed again. A low grunt forced from his lungs. The wedge drove deeper. The grating sound of wood on wood, a song of victory. The wheel's wobble lessened. It was still crooked, but it was seated. It would hold, at least until Brim Hollow. He stayed there for a moment, his shoulder pressed against the wood, his body trembling with exertion. The rain of ice continued, relentless. As he pushed himself back up, a violent gust of wind tore around the corner of the pass. It caught his heavy duster, whipping the canvas open and flinging one side of it around Eliza, who was still leaning out of the wagon. For a heartbeat, they were connected. The heavy, wet wool of his coat slapped against her, momentarily shielding her from the biting wind and ice. Underneath the cold, soaked fabric, there was the surprising, radiating heat of his body. It was a solid, living warmth that cut through the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She felt it on her arm, on her shoulder. It was the most profound sensation she had experienced all day, more real than the lurching wagon or the sting of the hail. She flinched, not away from him, but from the unexpected shock of it. Her breath caught. Luke, too, felt the contact. He felt the slightness of her frame under the coarse material, the sudden, sharp intake of her breath. He stopped, his hand still on the muddy wheel, and their eyes met again. The brief, crude misunderstanding from moments before was gone, replaced by something else entirely, a shared moment of stillness in the heart of the storm. It was a silent acknowledgement of a connection forged in crisis, a recognition of the simple, desperate fact of their shared survival. The moment was broken by the sound of a shutter banging shut from the town below. Down the slope, nestled in the fold of the hills, the first buildings of Brim Hollow were visible through the gray sheets of hail. A few windows, glowing with the faint, yellow light of oil lamps, had been watching. A curtain was twitched back into place at the general store. A face disappeared from the window of the saloon. They had not seen the failing wheel. They had not seen the desperate effort, the technical details of the repair. They had only seen a man pressing his body against a stranded woman's wagon in a storm. They had heard a woman's raw, desperate cry carried and distorted by the wind, the words tumbling over each other to become something else entirely. "Inside me, or I'll break." The story was already being written for them, down in the warm, dry buildings of Brim Hollow. A new piece of gossip was being passed from one person to the next, a tale seasoned with the half-hidden, half-malicious laughter of people with too much time and too little grace. The sound of it was already rising to meet them, quieter than the storm, but far more dangerous. Brim Hollow was a town that held its breath. It was tucked into a crease of the landscape, a single dusty street lined with buildings of sun-bleached wood that seemed to lean on each other for support. It was a place of closed doors and sharp eyes that watched from behind grimy window panes. For Eliza Hart, shelter came in the form of a derelict livery stable at the edge of town, rented for a price that was still too high. The place smelled of ghosts, the ghosts of horses, of rotted hay, of failed ambitions. The roof was a sieve. Each morning, shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a swirling, endless dance of dust motes. It was in one of these columns of light that Eliza set up her sewing machine. The heavy, black iron machine was her anchor in this shifting world. Its rhythmic clatter was a sound of creation, a steady heartbeat in the hollow shell of the stable. She'd spent the first day sweeping, clearing a space for herself, her movements precise and economical. She patched the worst of the holes in the wall with spare canvas from her wagon, turning a ruin into a workspace. She worked with a quiet, fierce determination, her needle stitching seams as the town stitched together its story about her, miles away. Luke Harrow returned to a silence of a different kind. His ranch, Cedar Wash, was less a place than a memory of what it was supposed to be. The small cabin his father had built was sound, but his eyes were always drawn to the barn, or what was left of it. A year ago, a fire had torn through it, leaving a blackened skeleton of timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. The blaze had taken his herd, his savings, and a piece of his soul. Even now, after a dozen rains and a hard winter, the air carried the bitter, persistent smell of char and ash. It was the smell of failure. He unsaddled his gelding, the familiar movements of his hands automatic. But his mind was elsewhere. It was on the pass, on the sting of the hail, on the look in a woman's eyes when she thought her world was about to splinter apart. The rumor, born in the storm, found fertile ground in the thirsty soil of Brim Hollow's saloons. It started as a whisper, a nudge between two miners at the bar of the dusty spur. "You hear about Harrow found himself a seamstress up on the pass?" The words were twisted, reshaped with every telling. Her desperate cry to save the wagon became a wanton plea. By nightfall, the story was that the new seamstress, this Eliza Hart, had been caught in a compromising position, begging the stoic Luke Harrow for something a woman shouldn't beg a man for out in the open. The laughter was low and ugly. It gave the idle and the mean-spirited something to chew on, and they savored it. It was oil for a lamp that was already burning. Cyrus Bell, president of the Brim Hollow Bank and owner of half the town, heard the talk and smiled. He was a man whose softness was a deception, His clean, manicured hands and tailored suits were a thin veneer over a core of cold, hard avarice. He found Luke the next morning, mending a fence line at the edge of his property. Bell didn't even dismount from his fine black mare. He looked down at Luke, his expression one of polite, predatory concern. "Harrow," he began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "A word." Luke straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He didn't like Bell. He didn't like the way the man's eyes were always measuring, calculating the value of land, of cattle, of a man's breaking point. "Bell, I've been reviewing your loan," Bell said, getting straight to it. "The one you took out after the unfortunate incident with your barn." The word unfortunate was coded in a false sympathy that made Luke's jaw tighten. "The board is growing concerned. Payments have been missed. The herd is gone. It takes time to rebuild," Luke said, his voice flat. "Time is a luxury, my friend. And the bank is not a charitable institution." Bell pulled a pocket watch from his vest. "You have 3 weeks, 21 days, to bring the account current. Otherwise, well, the contract is quite clear. The land will revert to the bank to cover the debt." He snapped the watch shut. "I do hope you can manage it. It's a fine piece of property. A shame to see it fall into the hands of creditors." He gave a thin smile, a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "I hear you've been occupied, distracted, perhaps. Do try to focus on your obligations." With a nod, he turned his horse and trotted away, leaving Luke standing in a silence that was heavier than any storm. 3 weeks. It was impossible. He was being squeezed, and he knew it. A few days later, Eliza was in the small parlor of the town preacher, Reverend Miller. His wife, a kindly woman with worried eyes, had commissioned Eliza to alter a Sunday dress. As Eliza knelt on the floor, pinning the hem, the parlor door was open just a crack. She could hear the Reverend talking in the next room with another man. The man's voice was confident, self-satisfied. It was Cyrus Bell. "It's simply a matter of applying the right pressure at the right time," Bell was saying, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "Take the old Henderson place, a few stray cattle, a fence mysteriously cut. Suddenly, he's overextended, desperate, sells for a song." There was a pause. "Or the Harrow Ranch, a fine property, just needed a little encouragement, a nudge in the right direction." A well-timed fire can be a very persuasive argument for a man to sell his holdings at a significant discount. Eliza's hand stilled. The pin she was holding pricked her finger. A single, perfect drop of blood welled up and stained the fabric. She stared at it, her mind racing. A well-timed fire. The half-burnt barn at Cedar Wash. The rumor she'd heard about Luke losing everything. It wasn't misfortune. It was a weapon. The blood on the dress felt like evidence of a crime she had just witnessed. "Mrs." Miller cleared her throat, and Eliza flinched, quickly returning to her work, her mind a turmoil of quiet fury. The town well was the only place where paths were guaranteed to cross. It was a neutral ground, a place of necessity. Eliza went in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the heat had begun to leach from the day. She was pulling up a bucket of water when she saw him. Luke Harrow was there, letting his horse drink from the trough. He moved with a weary grace, his shoulders slumped under a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. He didn't see her at first. As he turned from the trough, something white fell from his duster pocket and landed in the dust. A handkerchief. Eliza pulled her bucket clear and walked over. She picked it up, the cotton square surprisingly soft, though worn thin from use. "You dropped this." Luke turned. For a second, he looked straight at her, and she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. They were gray, the color of a winter sky. Then his gaze slid away, down to the handkerchief in her hand, then to a point somewhere over her shoulder. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Thank you," he mumbled, taking it from her. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, a ghost of a touch, but it sent a jolt through her, a memory of the warmth of his body in the storm. "The wheel is holding," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He nodded, still not looking at her. "Good." An awkward silence stretched between them, thick with the things they weren't saying. The air was filled with the gentle slop of water from the trough and the buzz of a lazy fly. She wanted to ask about his ranch, about the rumor, about the fire. She wanted to warn him about Cyrus Bell, but the wall around him was too high. He was a man locked inside himself. "I should go," he said, his voice rough. He turned and swung himself into the saddle in one fluid motion. Without another word, without a backward glance, he rode out of town, kicking up a small cloud of dust that settled over everything, including the space where he had just stood. Eliza watched him go, a strange ache in her chest. She understood his retreat. It was a language she knew well, but his felt older, deeper. Luke rode hard, pushing his horse, needing the wind in his face. He wasn't just fleeing the town, or the woman with the steady, unnerving gaze. He was fleeing a ghost. Every time he felt that flicker of connection, that pull toward someone else, the memory rose up to choke him. The memory of his younger brother, Sam. It came in flashes of heat and smoke, the panicked shouts, the smell of burning pine and terror. Sam, younger, rasher, convinced he could save the horses trapped in the barn. Luke had screamed at him not to go in, had grabbed for his arm, but Sam had shaken him off. "They're our future," Luke, he'd yelled, and plunged into the roaring inferno. A moment later, the main crossbeam, weakened by the fire, had collapsed with a sound like the world breaking in two. The screaming had stopped. Luke had been the one to hold his father back, the one who had to stand there and watch the barn burn, knowing his brother was inside. He had failed to stop him. He had failed to save him. He associated trust with tragedy, connection with loss. Getting close to someone was a risk he couldn't afford to take again. He had Cedar Wash to think about. He had his father's legacy, what was left of it, to protect. And this woman, with her quiet strength and her storm-tossed hair, felt like the most dangerous risk of all. That night, back in the dusty silence of her stable, Eliza lit a small oil lamp. The soft light pushed back the shadows, creating a small circle of warmth and order. She took out a small, leather-bound journal and a pencil. For a long time, she just sat, listening to the clatter of her sewing machine echoing in her memory. Then she began to write, her pencil scratching softly in the quiet. The entry was short, a distillation of the day's encounters, of the banker's cold threat and the cowboy's deep-set fear. She wrote, "To heal on the inside, you must first trust someone on the outside." She closed the book, the words a quiet promise to herself. She didn't know if the man with the haunted gray eyes could ever be that person. But as she looked around the stable, she was slowly taming. She knew she had to try, for both their sakes. The memories came at night, unbidden, smelling of smoke. Luke would be staring into the darkness of his cabin, and the darkness would catch fire. It wasn't a narrative, not a story he could tell. It was a series of brutal snapshots burned onto the back of his eyes. The roar, a living thing, a beast made of heat and air that devoured wood and hope. The orange light dancing on the panicked eyes of the horses, their screams a terrible counterpoint to the fire's hunger. Sam's face, young, stubborn, streaked with soot, caught for a single, eternal second in the barn's gaping maw. His mouth was open, shouting something Luke could no longer hear over the fire's voice. "They're our future. Luke—" He'd shoved Luke's restraining hand away. A brother's touch, rejected. Then, the sound, not the roar, but a sharp, final crack, the sound of a giant spine snapping. The main crossbeam, black against the orange heart of the inferno, surrendering to the heat, it fell. And after the crash, a new sound silence. The place where Sam's shouts had been was now an absolute void. The fire still roared, but it was the silence inside the roar that deafened Luke, the silence that had lived inside him ever since. He'd see his father's face then, months later, the old man wasting away in his bed, the grief having eaten him from the inside out. His voice was a dry rattle of leaves. "It's the Harrow curse, son," he'd whispered, his bony fingers gripping Luke's arm. "This land. Whoever holds it pays for it, pays with blood." It wasn't a warning, it was a verdict, a legacy of debt to be paid to the unforgiving dirt. Eliza, too, had ghosts, though hers were quieter. They didn't scream. They whispered of betrayal in neat, respectable parlors. She had been in Kansas, engaged to a merchant named Silas. He was a man who smelled of cinnamon and starched collars, a man who promised a life as orderly and predictable as his ledgers. She had believed in that promise. She had stitched her own wedding dress, the lace fine as frost on a window pane. The illusion had unraveled like a cheap seam. She had gone to the stagecoach office to confirm a shipment for Silas's store. The station master, a man with damp palms and a shifting gaze, had smirked at her. He spoke of special arrangements, of how Silas's cargo always got priority, always came through unscathed. He winked. A man like Silas knows how to trade for favors, keeps his accounts balanced, one way or another. The meaning hung in the air, thick and foul. He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about his lonely wife, about the gifts Silas brought her, about the backroom deals that had nothing to do with commerce. Eliza had gone back and laid the truth on the polished dining table between them. She had expected denials, outrage. Instead, she got a cold, pragmatic calm. It's how the world works. Eliza, Silas had told her, adjusting his cuffs. One must be practical. She had looked at the man she was to marry, at the wedding dress waiting in her room, and she saw a rot, a crack in the very foundation of the life he offered. She didn't just break the engagement. She told the preacher. She told the mayor's wife. She told the truth, and the truth was a fire of its own. It cost her everything. The town closed ranks around one of its own prosperous sons. She, the outsider, the troublemaker, was left with nothing but her sewing machine and the road. She had been running ever since, trusting only the strength in her own two hands. Her machine was her only true companion. One afternoon, in the middle of a complex line of stitching on a farmer's canvas coat, the rhythm broke. There was a sharp crack of wood, and the foot treadle went limp, swinging uselessly. Eliza stopped, her heart sinking. She knelt and examined the damage. The wooden pitman connecting the treadle to the flywheel had snapped. The wood was old, dried out, and had finally given up. Without it, the machine was just a heavy piece of iron. Her livelihood was broken. She needed wood, not just any piece of scrap. It had to be strong, straight-grained, seasoned hardwood that wouldn't warp or splinter under the constant rocking motion. She thought of the lumber yard, but that cost money she didn't have. Then she thought of him, of Luke Harrow. A rancher would know wood. He rode into town 2 days later for supplies, his face set in the same grim, distant lines. Eliza saw him from the doorway of her stable and, taking a breath, stepped out to meet him. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She showed him the broken piece. He took it, turning the splintered wood over in his calloused hands. He ran a thumb over the fracture. He understood immediately. Pine, too soft, dries out. He looked from the broken piece to her silent machine. Then, for a brief second, his eyes met hers. He saw not a damsel in distress, but a fellow craftsman with a broken tool. "Wait here," was all he said. An hour later, he was back. He didn't have a piece of lumber, he had a plank. It was a beautiful length of seasoned cedar, smooth and rich with a reddish gold color, the grain straight and true. It smelled faintly of thyme and horses and hay. "From the loft in the old barn," he said, his voice low, the part the fire didn't touch. He was offering her a piece of his survival, a piece of what was still whole. They worked in the slanted afternoon light of the stable. The air was thick with the scent of the cedar, a clean, sharp smell that cut through the mustiness. He had the tools, a small saw, a drill, but she was the one who understood the machine's mechanics. She was the expert here. After he had cut and shaped the new pitman, it was time to attach it. He held the small, hand-forged nail, ready to drive it home. "Wait," she said softly. She reached out and her fingers brushed his as she touched the wood. He flinched almost imperceptibly, but didn't pull away. "You can't just force it. The grain is softer here." She traced a line on the wood with her fingernail. "You have to guide the nail. Let it find its own way. Push it deep inside the softer grain. or you'll split the whole piece." Her words were practical, a simple instruction, but in the quiet of the stable, with the dust motes dancing in the light, they took on another meaning. He looked at her hand, her fingers slender but strong against the weathered wood. To guide the nail, he had to get closer. He shifted, his shoulder brushing against hers. She put her hand over his, steadying the nail. "Like this," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her touch was light, but it sent a current through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Outside, in the alley that ran alongside the stable, 2 idlers from the saloon had stopped. They had seen Harrow's horse and, drawn by a lazy, malicious curiosity, they peered through a wide crack between the wallboards. They couldn't see the broken machine. They couldn't see the tools or the new cedar plank. They saw a man and a woman, heads bowed close together in the dim light. They saw her hand covering his. They saw an intimacy that their sordid minds could only interpret one way. And they heard her low voice, the words drifting clearly through the crack. Deep inside the softer grain. One man nudged the other, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, his voice a greasy chuckle. "Looks like she's teaching him more than just sewing, teaching him how to get deep inside." They snickered, backing away to carry this new, improved version of the rumor back to the saloon. Luke heard it. A rustle, a choked-off laugh. His head snapped up. The warmth from her touch turned to ice. He was exposed. The town was always watching, always twisting. The curse wasn't just blood and fire. It was this, too. The poison of whispers. He stood up abruptly, stepping back, breaking the contact. The space between them suddenly felt like a chasm. "That should hold," he said, his voice gruff, strangled. He wouldn't look at her. He gathered his tools with jerky, angry movements and was gone before she could say a word. Eliza stood frozen, her hand still tingling from the memory of his. She had felt something shift in that moment, a small piece of a wall coming down. Now it was back up, higher and colder than before. With a sigh, she sat down at her machine. She pushed the newly repaired treadle with her foot. It moved smoothly, powerfully. Thump, 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 thump. A steady, rhythmic beat, walking away, his back rigid. Luke could still hear it. Thump, 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 thump. It echoed the frantic hammering in his own chest. He was walking away, but the sound followed him, a steady, persistent heartbeat in the quiet afternoon air. That evening, by the light of her lamp, Eliza took a small scrap of white linen. She threaded a needle with dark blue silk. She didn't work on a customer's garment. This was for her, with tiny, precise stitches. She embroidered a short line of text onto the scrap. When she was finished, she took her own sturdy work coat from a peg. She carefully opened a seam in the lining, right over the heart. She tucked the small embroidered patch inside, a secret message against her own skin, and stitched the seam closed again, the stitches so fine they were invisible. The patch read, "One must sew oneself whole before sewing the lives of others." The wind changed first. For a week, it had been a predictable breeze from the north, carrying the clean scent of distant pine and high country rock. Then, one afternoon, it stopped. The air went still and heavy, the silence so profound that Eliza, working in her stable, could hear the frantic buzz of a single fly trapped against a window pane. The sunlight turned a sickly, coppery yellow. A fine, almost invisible dust began to settle on every surface, a fine silt that felt gritty between the teeth. She had made up her mind that morning. The words she'd overheard Cyrus Bell speak had festered inside her, a poison of injustice. She couldn't keep them to herself. Luke Harrow deserved to know that the fire that had crippled him was not an act of God, but an act of greed. It was a dangerous truth to carry, and an even more dangerous one to deliver. She'd saddled the old mare she'd bought with her first earnings in Brim Hollow and ridden out toward Cedar Wash, a small parcel of mended shirts for Luke serving as her excuse. By the time she reached his land, the horizon was gone. A monstrous, roiling wall of brown dust was advancing from the south. swallowing the sky. It moved with a terrifying speed. The air grew thick, tasting of dirt. Luke was out by the remains of his barn, trying to secure a loose piece of roofing tin. His movements hurried. He saw her coming and his face hardened with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "This is no time for a social call," he yelled over the rising shriek of the wind. "You need to be back in town. It wasn't a social call," she yelled back, swinging down from the mare as the first real gust hit them, a physical blow that staggered her and tore the words from her lips. "It's about Cyrus Bell," I heard him talking. "About the fire." The look on his face changed. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. But there was no time. The world went from yellow to a deep, suffocating brown. The storm was on them. "The cabin!" now he shouted, grabbing the bridle of her horse and practically dragging the animal and her toward the small, sturdy building. They stumbled inside just as the full fury of the sandstorm hit. The sound was a deafening, abrasive roar, as if the world were being scoured down to bare rock. Luke slammed the heavy plank door shut, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Fine. Stinging dust immediately began to jet through every crack around the frame. He dropped the thick wooden bar into its iron brackets, securing it. For a moment, they were safe in the dim, dusty interior. Then came a sound louder than the wind's howl, a sharp, violent crack of tortured metal. One of the door's heavy iron hinges, weakened by years of weather and stress, snapped in two. The door, now held only by the bottom hinge and the bar, bowed inward under the relentless pressure of the wind. The top corner flew open a few inches, and the storm poured in. It wasn't just dust anymore. It was a river. A torrent of sand and grit blasted into the cabin, instantly filling the air, stinging their eyes, clogging their throats. The noise was apocalyptic. The door bucked and slammed against the frame like a living thing trying to break free. "The bottom hinge won't hold," Luke roared, throwing his shoulder against the wood. The plank shuddered, threatening to splinter. Eliza was already moving. She saw a heavy plank, the same one he had brought her, leaning against the wall. It was meant to be a new shelf. Now, it was their only hope. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. Together, they wrestled the heavy cedar board. It was awkward, heavy, fighting them at every turn. The air was so thick with dust they could barely see each other. Two ghosts struggling in a brown twilight. They managed to wedge one end of the plank against the floor and lever the other against the middle of the groaning door. It gave them a moment's respite. The door was braced, but the wind was a battering ram, and it was still finding purchase. The loose top corner of the door was the problem. It was flapping, catching the wind like a sail, and with every powerful gust, it ripped more screws from the bottom hinge. They could hear them groaning, popping one by one. The entire door was about to be torn from its frame. If that happened, the wind would have a direct entry point. It would get under the eaves of the roof and peel it off like a can lid. The cabin, their only shelter, would come apart around them. "We need to secure the top," Luke yelled, his face a mask of dirt, his eyes red and streaming. He was holding the bracing plank with all his weight, the muscles in his back and arms corded with strain. "I need nails, a hammer." Eliza fumbled in the near darkness, her hands searching his workbench. Her fingers closed around a heavy hammer, then a handful of long, thick nails. Time was contracting, each second stretching into an eternity of roaring wind and splintering wood. She stumbled back to the door. "I can't let go," he grunted, his body trembling with the effort of holding the plank. "I'll do it." She tried to hammer a nail through the top of the door into the frame, but it was impossible. The door was bucking too violently. The nail flew from her fingers, lost in the chaos. The axe, the small axe from his belt, still lying on the floor. An idea, desperate and mechanical, flashed in her mind. A brace, a chalk, not nails. She grabbed the axe, the bar she coughed, the dust rasping in her throat. The crossbar. "We need to block the corner." She was talking about the heavy oak bar he'd first dropped to lock the door. If they could somehow get it into the top corner, wedged between the door and the frame. He understood instantly. With a roar of effort, he shifted his weight. freeing one hand for a fraction of a second to lift the bar from its brackets. He thrust it at her. The door slammed inward, throwing him off balance. The main bracing plank slipped, and the full, terrifying force of the storm smashed against the door. He was losing it. Eliza held the heavy oak bar, her mind racing, calculating angles and forces just as she would with a complex piece of fabric. The bar was too long to fit horizontally, but vertically, if she could wedge it. Her lungs burned. She was suffocating. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her focus. They were seconds away from disaster. The roof timbers overhead groaned, a sound of imminent failure. The cabin, her life, his life. It was all about to be ripped apart. The words tore from her. Not a plea this time, but a frantic, breathless command. A schematic for survival gasped into the storm. "The axe inside me," she choked out, pointing with the bar to the door jamb right beside her own body. "Wedge it inside me, or I'll never feel whole again." She meant the space, the gap, the vital, structural point on the inside of the door frame next to her. She was telling him to drive the head of the axe into the jamb to create a purchase point, a stop for the oak bar. If he didn't secure that one point, the whole structure would fail. They would be exposed, broken. There was no misunderstanding this time. In the swirling chaos, his eyes met hers and he saw no fear, only a fierce, desperate clarity. He saw the mechanic, the engineer, the woman who understood how things held together and how they broke. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, grabbing the axe from her. With two powerful, precise blows, he drove the axe head deep into the thick wood of the door frame, right where she had indicated. It created a solid, immovable steel shelf. Now he yelled, "Together!" They forced the end of the heavy oak bar against the axe head and angled the other end against the flapping top corner of the door. "Push," he commanded. They threw their combined weight against it. The bar was the lever. The axe head was the fulcrum. The door was the resistance. For a heart-stopping moment, the wind pushed back, an irresistible force. Then, with a final, desperate shove, the bar snapped into place. The corner of the door slammed shut. The bucking stopped. They leaned against their makeshift brace, the roaring of the wind suddenly, blessedly, muffled. It was still there, a monstrous pressure on the other side of the wood. But it was outside. They were inside. Silence fell. A heavy, thick silence, punctuated only by the sound of their own ragged, desperate breaths and the soft hiss of sand finding its way through the few remaining tiny cracks. The cabin was almost completely dark, the dust so thick it seemed to swallow the light. They didn't move. They just stood there, pressed against the door they had fought and won, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. They listened as their heartbeats, which had been hammering in a frantic rhythm of survival, slowly began to calm, like embers cooling after a fire. Eliza became aware that her hands were shaking uncontrollably, the reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. Luke saw it. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his handkerchief. It was the same one she had returned to him at the well. He pushed it into her trembling hands. The simple gesture, a small act of care in the dusty darkness, was more intimate than any touch. The distance between them was the thickness of the door they leaned against, and the vast, unspoken territory of their pasts. He found a candle and a match, his movements slow and deliberate. A small, steady flame flickered to life, pushing back the darkness just enough to illuminate their small, protected world. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, their faces caked with dirt, their hair matted with grit. He sank down onto a bench, his back against the wall, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. She slid down to sit on the floor, her own back resting against the door, the handkerchief clutched in her hands. The candle flame danced between them. The wind howled outside, a reminder of the chaos held at bay. In the quiet of the cabin, the sound only served to deepen their isolation, cocooning them. "You said you heard Belle," Luke said, his voice a low rasp. It wasn't a question. It was an opening. Eliza nodded, her gaze fixed on the candle flame. She told him. She repeated the words she had overheard. her voice flat and devoid of emotion, letting the ugly truth of them stand on its own. A well-timed fire can be a very persuasive argument. Luke didn't react. He didn't curse or rage. He just sat there, his head bowed, and stared at his own hands as if he'd never seen them before. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, scraped raw. My brother, Sam, he died in that fire. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and devastating. He had never spoken those words aloud to anyone but his father. He went in for the horses. Luke continued, the story coming out in broken fragments, like he was pulling splinters from a wound. I tried to stop him. He wouldn't listen. The main beam fell. He looked up at her then, and in the flickering candlelight, she saw the raw, unhealed grief in his eyes. It was a pain so deep it had become a part of him. My father said it was a curse. The land, he said it demanded blood. Eliza listened, her own heart aching for him. She knew about carrying burdens that no one else could see. When he fell silent, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She offered a piece of her own brokenness in return. I was supposed to be married once, she said softly, her voice finding a surprising strength in the small, warm space. In Kansas, to a merchant. She told him about Silas, about his practical betrayals, about the coldness in his eyes when he explained that integrity was a luxury he couldn't afford. He thought I would be practical too, that I would accept the cracks in the foundation just to have a roof over my head. She looked around the small, dusty cabin, at the door they had fought to hold. I learned that a broken house is worse than no house at all. I've been on my own ever since. They were no longer just a cowboy and a seamstress. They were two people who had seen the world splinter apart and had chosen to survive. They talked for hours as the candle burned lower, the storm raging impotently outside. They exchanged the quiet, heavy truths of their lives, not as a burden, but as a gift. With each story, the space between them seemed to shrink, until all that was left was the small, steady flame and a fragile, nascent trust. Outside, huddled on the leeward side of a rock outcropping, two men waited for the storm to abate. They were the same men who had spied on them in the stable. But tonight they were not idle. They were on Cyrus Bell's payroll. Their original task had been to deliver a warning, to do some damage to the cabin to remind Harrow of his vulnerability. The storm had interrupted their plans, but the storm had also provided an opportunity. Through the worst of it, they had seen the door fail. They had watched the desperate struggle. And now, in a lull in the wind, one of them crept to the cabin. He couldn't see in, but he could touch. He ran his fingers over the wood, feeling the deep score where the axe had been driven into the jamb, tracing the position of the brace. He tapped the planking softly with his knuckles, memorizing its weak points, its structure, its makeshift repair. He was an architect of ruin, and he was taking notes for another night, a darker night. The world after the sandstorm was raw and scoured clean. A fragile sun shone on a landscape that had been remade, the familiar contours of the land softened and blurred by a new layer of fine, red dust. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick, but the light filtering through the single grimy window was a promise of survival. For a day, Luke and Eliza worked in a near-silent partnership born of shared crisis. They cleared the dust, which had coated every surface like a fine velvet shroud, and reinforced the damaged door, their movements economical and synchronized. They did not speak of the storm, nor of the stories they had shared in the dark. The words were too new, too fragile to be exposed to the light of day. They existed in the space between them, a foundation that was still settling. Eliza returned to Brim Hollow to find her own small stable similarly invaded by the storm. As she was sweeping the last of the dust from the floorboards, a carriage stopped outside. It was Mrs. Beatrice Bell, the banker's wife, a woman who seemed insulated from the grit of the world by layers of silk and good intentions. "Miss Hart," she called, her voice a pleasant but distant melody. "I am in a dreadful state. The storm did such damage to my husband's favorite cashmere coat. The lining is quite torn. I was hoping you could mend it. Urgently. He has a trip to the capital next week. Eliza felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of handling anything belonging to Cyrus Bell felt like touching something unclean. But she needed the money. More than that. An opportunity. Sharp and dangerous, pricked at the edge of her thoughts. Of course. Mrs. Bell. I would be happy to. The coat was as soft as a whisper, a garment of obscene luxury in this hard-bitten town. That evening, in the quiet of her stable, Eliza laid it carefully on her work table. The damage was just as Beatrice had said, a long, L-shaped tear in the silk lining of an inside pocket. She turned the pocket inside out to get a clean angle for her stitches. As she did, something papery, tucked deep into the corner of the seam, fluttered out and landed on the table. It was a receipt from the general store. It was folded small, as if someone had tried to make it disappear. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The ink was faded but legible. It was an invoice for 5 gallons of pine oil, a dozen cotton rags, and a flint and steel striker. Items for starting a fire, a very large, very hot fire. Her eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page. The date was written in the storekeeper's neat, spidery script. It was a year ago, the day before the fire at Cedar Wash. And then she saw the name, signed at the bottom to acknowledge receipt of the goods. It wasn't Cyrus Bell. It was a man she recognized, a hulking, silent man who was always in Bell's shadow, one of the 2 men she had seen lurking outside her stable, Jedediah Grimes. The piece of paper felt heavier than lead in her hand. It wasn't a story anymore. It wasn't a suspicion born of overheard words. It was proof, tangible, damning proof. The ride back out to Cedar Wash was different. This time she wasn't carrying an excuse, she was carrying a weapon. She found Luke reinforcing the fence line where the storm had weakened it, his movements slow and deliberate, as if his body ached. She didn't say a word, just held out the receipt. He took it, wiping his hands on his trousers first. He read it once, then twice. A muscle in his jaw twitched, a small, violent storm in the stillness of his face. He looked out at the blackened skeleton of his barn, the receipt now trembling in his powerful hand. He had lived with the ghost of that fire for a year, blaming the land, a curse, his own brother's recklessness. Now the ghost had a name and a face. He looked at Eliza, his eyes dark with a pain and fury that was terrifying to behold. He crushed the paper in his fist. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "It's not enough. It's his man's name, not his. They'll say Grimes was buying it for himself. They'll lie. They always lie." "It's a start," Eliza insisted, her own voice quiet but firm. "It's a thread. We pull on it and see what unravels." He shook his head, the motion full of a deep and profound weariness. He looked at the land around them, at the small cabin, at the graves of his parents and brother on the nearby hill. "Touching Cyrus Bell in this town, this land will become a grave," he said, the words heavy with the finality of a prophecy. It was his father's curse, all over again. Eliza stepped closer. She would not let him retreat into that darkness. "A grave is what they're digging for us if we stay silent," she countered, her voice ringing with a conviction that cut through his despair. "He burned your past. Luke, he's trying to steal your future. He sent men to your door, men who would have let that storm tear us apart. We either fight with this, or we let them bury us." He stared at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. She wasn't afraid, or if she was, she had stitched that fear into a lining and hidden it away. She was offering him not comfort, but a sword. Slowly, deliberately, he uncurled his fist and smoothed the wrinkled receipt. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He didn't smile. The grim set of his jaw didn't change, but he nodded. Once. Their investigation began not with questions, but with observation. The receipt was for a large quantity of oil, too much for one man. It would have required a wagon. For 2 days, they rode the periphery of the town, not looking for a road, but for its ghost. They were looking for old tracks, overgrown and forgotten, leading away from the main thoroughfares. It was Luke who found them, his eyes trained to read the subtle language of the land. a pair of faint ruts, nearly erased by a year of weather. Branching off from a little-used cattle trail and heading toward a series of low, scrub-covered hills, they followed the tracks on foot, leaving their horses tethered out of sight. The trail led them to a place that had been deliberately forgotten. It was an old, abandoned homestead. The cabin long since collapsed into a pile of rotting logs. Only the barn was still standing, though its roof sagged and its walls listed, as if the whole structure were tired of its own existence. The air around it was stale, smelling of decay and rat droppings. But as they got closer, another smell asserted itself, faint but sharp and unmistakable. The lingering chemical tang of pine oil. It had soaked into the very dirt. The big barn doors were swollen shut. They found a small side door, its latch rusted through. Luke put his shoulder to it, and the rotted wood gave way with a groan of protest. They stepped inside, into a gloom thick with dust and silence. Sunlight pierced the decaying roof in a few places, creating spotlights on the dusty floor. It was in one of these circles of light that they saw it, a dark, greasy stain on the packed earth, the place where the oil had been stored, where some had certainly been spilled, and all around the stain, another clue: fresh sawdust. Not the gray, ancient dust that coated everything else, but pale, almost golden sawdust, scattered in a distinct arc. Someone had been sawing wood here. Recently. Eliza knelt down, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. Her fingers, trained to spot the smallest detail, brushed aside some of the dust. They closed around something small and hard. She held it up to the light. It was a brass button, blackened and warped by intense heat. She could just make out a raised letter on its surface. An elegant, curling B. It was from a uniform of some kind, not a common work shirt. Luke had moved to the far wall. "Eliza," he said, his voice tight. "Look at this." He was pointing at the frame of a side door, the one opposite from where they'd entered. The door itself was gone, but the heavy iron bolt latch was still attached to the frame, or part of it was. The thick iron bolt had been sawn clean through. He ran his finger over the cut, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Look at the marks," he murmured, almost to himself. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and scraped away some of the rust. The parallel grooves left by the teeth of a saw blade were revealed. It's a wide-set blade, uneven. One tooth is chipped. See here, it leaves a deeper score every third mark. Eliza looked, but it was the expression on his face that held her. It was a look of dawning, terrible recognition. "The men who came to the cabin during the storm," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After they left, I examined the marks they left on the door frame. They tried to saw through the wood next to the lock before the storm got too bad." He looked from the sawn bolt in his hands to the empty space in front of Eliza. "The saw marks, they're the same. The connection slammed into place, as solid and brutal as a locked door. The same tool, the same men, the arson that had killed his brother and the attack on the cabin were linked. It was all Cyrus Bell. It was a systematic, ruthless campaign to drive him off his land. We have it," Eliza breathed, staring at the severed latch. "This is the other end of the thread." Luke carefully worked the damaged latch from the rotting wood of the door frame. It came free in his hands, a heavy, ugly piece of iron. It was the truth, and it was as heavy as a weapon. "We need to protect these," Eliza said, her practical nature taking over. "The button, the latch, they can't get wet. The rust could obscure the marks." She took a small canvas pouch from her saddlebag, one she used for her more delicate tools. She also produced a small candle stub, back outside, in the fading light. She lit the candle and let the wax drip onto the canvas, rubbing it into the fibers with her thumb until a section of the cloth was waterproof and stiff. It was a simple, resourceful act, a skill from her life on the road. Luke watched her, a sense of wonder cutting through his anger. He knew how to build a fence, how to mend a harness, how to fight a storm. She knew how to preserve evidence. She carefully wrapped the singed button and the heavy iron latch in the waxed cloth, folding the edges tight, creating a sealed, protected bundle. She handed it to Luke. "You keep it. It's your story to tell." He took the small, heavy package, the warmth of her hands still on the canvas. He tucked it into an inside pocket of his coat. They were a team. It was a thought so new, so foreign, that it almost scared him more than Belle did. They started back as twilight began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of purple and bruised orange. They rode in silence, the weight of what they had found settling between them. The world felt different now, charged with menace. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. Every rustle of the wind in the scrub brush sounded like a whisper. They were halfway back to the ranch, riding through a narrow cut between two rocky mesas, when Luke's horse suddenly shied, its ears flattening. He pulled the animal to a halt, his hand instinctively going to the rifle in its scabbard. Eliza stopped beside him, her own body tense. The silence was absolute, too absolute. No crickets, no nightbirds. Then they heard it, a faint, metallic scrape from the rocks above them on the right. Chink, a pause, then another, from the left. Chink, chink. It was the sound of metal spurs on rock, the sound of men getting into position. A low voice drifted down from the darkness, a lazy, confident drawl. "That's far enough. Harrow." Shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the rocks. One in front, two on the ridge to their left, another two on their right. They were surrounded. A glint of moonlight caught the long, cold barrel of a rifle. The soft, final click of a hammer being cocked echoed in the narrow space. It sounded like teeth, grinding in the dark. The click of the hammer was the only sound in the world. It was a small, dry noise that cut through the twilight, sharp and final. Luke didn't hesitate. There was no time for thought, only for the brutal calculus of survival. 5 guns to his 1, and they held the high ground. To fight was to die. Eliza now. His voice was a low command, not a shout, in one fluid, violent motion. He spurred his horse forward, not away, but directly toward her. He leaned from the saddle, his arm hooking around her waist, and lifted her clean off her mare. She gave a startled cry as she was pulled from her own saddle and landed hard in front of him, her body colliding with his. For a second, they were a clumsy, tangled mess of limbs. He slapped the rump of her mare hard, sending the frightened animal bolting riderless down the narrow canyon in the opposite direction. A perfect decoy for a heartbeat. The men on the rocks were confused. A rifle shot cracked, the bullet whining off the canyon wall where they had been a second before. That was all the time Luke needed. He wheeled his powerful gelding, a horse bred for speed and stamina, and dug his heels in. The horse leaped forward, muscles bunching, launching them into the deep shadows of a thicket of cottonwood trees. The world dissolved into a blur of gray trunks and whipping branches. Hoofbeats thundered behind them. 3 riders giving chase, their curses swallowed by the dense woods. Luke rode with a desperate, innate knowledge of the terrain, weaving a path that was not a path at all, but a series of calculated risks. Branches tore at their clothes, at their skin. Eliza pressed her face against his back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her world reduced to the pounding of the horse's heart, the pounding of her own, and the solid, tense wall of his body. The air was filled with the soft, white fluff of cottonwood seeds, a surreal, silent snowfall in the middle of a frantic race for their lives. He was not just running. He was aiming for a specific point, a flaw in the landscape he could turn to their advantage. The sound of rushing water grew from a whisper to a roar, and they burst from the trees onto the high, crumbling bank of Cotton Creek. The bridge was a nightmare. It was a skeletal ruin of wood and rope slung across a chasm where the creek churned white and violent over a bed of jagged, black rocks. It looked as if a single strong wind could tear it from its moorings. The wooden planks were warped and missing in places, showing the hungry water below. It was less a bridge and more a suggestion of one. Their pursuers were close, crashing through the undergrowth behind them. There was no other way across. "Hold on," Luke gritted out, his voice tight with strain. He urged the horse onto the bridge. The animal balked, its eyes rolling at the swaying, groaning structure. The planks screamed in protest under its weight. The entire bridge swayed sickeningly, a pendulum of rotting wood over a torrent. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped Luke's shirt. She could feel every shift, every groan of the wood through the body of the horse. They were halfway across when the first rider broke through the trees on the bank they had just left. He was a silhouette against the dying light, raising a pistol. Luke didn't look back. He had been waiting for this. The moment the horse's front hooves touched the solid ground of the far bank, he acted. His body uncoiled. Now he shouted, a warning and a command in one. While the horse was still scrambling for purchase, he leaned far out of the saddle, the small hatchet from his belt already in his hand. He wasn't aiming for the main support cables. They were too thick. He was aiming for a secondary guide rope, a thick twist of hemp that stabilized their side of the span. The hatchet rose and fell in a single, brutal arc. The blade was sharp. It bit deep into the rope. Fibers parted with a sound like a giant's tearing cloth. He struck again, putting all his weight and desperation into the blow. The rope snapped. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Deprived of its anchoring tension, the bridge twisted violently. A wave of structural failure cascaded across the span. The half they had just crossed sagged, planks ripping free from their crossbeams with a series of sharp, percussive cracks. With a final, agonized groan, the entire far section of the bridge tore away and plunged into the creek below, a waterfall of splintered wood that was swallowed by the churning water. They had cut off the path behind them, but one of the men was fast. As the bridge disintegrated under his horse's feet, he abandoned the animal and threw himself forward in a desperate, athletic leap. His fingers, scrabbling for purchase, found the edge of the last intact plank on their side. He clung there, his body dangling over the abyss, his boots kicking for a foothold that wasn't there. He started to haul himself up, his face a mask of grim determination. A long knife was already appearing in his free hand. Luke's horse, terrified by the collapsing bridge and the man suddenly appearing at its feet, began to buck and rear. Luke fought for control, his attention divided between the panicked animal and the man clawing his way up from the chasm. Eliza saw the glint of the knife. She saw the man's knuckles, white with effort. She had no gun, no weapon. She had only what she always carried. Instinct took over. Her hand darted into the deep pocket of her skirt and closed around the familiar, solid weight of a wooden spool of waxed linen thread. It was heavy, dense, the thread itself strong enough to stitch leather. In a single, fluid motion born of 10,000 precise movements. She acted. She didn't throw it to hurt him. She threw it to ensnare him. She let the spool fly, her wrist snapping as if she were casting a fishing line. The heavy spool sailed through the air, the tough, waxy thread unreeling behind it in a perfect, straight line. It whipped around the man's upraised wrist, the one holding the knife, and in the same arc, looped itself around the dangling leather reins of Luke's horse. The horse, already fighting the bit, felt the new, sharp tug on its reins from an unexpected direction. It reacted with pure animal panic, throwing its head back and rearing high. The waxed thread, now tangled in the reins, pulled taut, as strong as a steel wire. The man gave a choked cry of surprise. The thread bit into his wrist, yanking him with the irresistible force of the terrified horse. His grip on the bridge was torn away. For a moment he was suspended in midair, a puppet on a string, before he was flung backward and slammed down hard onto the rocky bank. He landed with a sickening final thud and did not move. On the far side of the chasm, the two remaining riders stared, momentarily stunned. One of them, his face contorted with rage, lifted his rifle. He had no clear shot, but he fired anyway, a blast of pure frustration. The shot was loud, a flat, ugly crack that echoed off the rock walls. The bullet went wide, but it found a target. It slammed into one of the thick, weathered support posts of the bridge, not 3 feet from Luke's head. The wood exploded. A long, dagger-like splinter, thick as a man's thumb, was blasted from the post. It flew with the speed of the bullet itself and struck Luke high on his left shoulder, just below the collarbone. It didn't graze him. It impaled him, punching through his thick shirt and burying itself deep in muscle. A raw, guttural cry of pain was torn from Luke's throat. He slumped forward, the shock and the searing agony of the wound nearly knocking him from the saddle. His left arm went limp, useless. Eliza grabbed him, her arm shooting around his chest to hold him upright. Luke. He shook his head, fighting against the blackness that threatened to overwhelm him. He could hear the men shouting across the chasm, but they were trapped. With his good hand, he gripped the reins and kicked the horse, forcing the animal away from the precipice and into the deepening gloom of the forest. He let the horse run for 100 yards before the adrenaline gave out and the pain became a white-hot, consuming fire. He pulled the animal to a halt, his body swaying. Eliza slid to the ground, her own legs unsteady beneath her. The splinter protruded obscenely from his shoulder, a piece of the bridge he had just destroyed, now a part of him. Dark blood was already soaking the fabric of his shirt, a spreading stain in the twilight. "Don't," he gasped, as she reached for it. "Don't pull it." She knew that. To remove it would be to open the floodgates. She reacted with the cold, clear pragmatism of a surgeon. She ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat. Her hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor, but her movements were efficient. She folded the cloth into a thick compress and pressed it firmly against the wound, packing it around the base of the splinter, applying steady, desperate pressure. As she held the cloth in place, her lips began to move, forming words that were barely audible. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was whispering a count, a steady, rhythmic cadence against the chaos. It was a litany to ward off panic, a way to anchor her mind to the task, to the simple, physical reality of the pressure of her hands against his warm, bleeding body, as if the land itself were weeping for them. The sky opened. A cold rain began to fall, first as a whisper, then as a steady, cleansing downpour. It slicked their hair to their heads, washed the grime from their faces, and turned the dusty ground to dark, greedy mud. The few drops of Luke's blood that had fallen on the trail sizzled for a moment before being swallowed by the rain, erased as if they had never been. The storm was washing their tracks away, granting them a clean escape. They stood there for a long moment, the only sound the hiss of the rain on the leaves, soaked, shivering, wounded, but alive. Eliza's tremors grew worse, the full shock of the chase, the fall, the gunshot, finally hitting her. Luke, his face pale and beaded with a mixture of rain and sweat, looked down at her. He lifted his good right hand and placed it over hers, adding his strength to the pressure on the wound. His grip was firm, a solid anchor in the shaking, wet world. He didn't speak. There were no words for what had just passed between them, for what they had just done to survive. The gratitude, the terror, the fierce, unspoken partnership, it all existed in the simple, steady pressure of his hand on hers. A thank you trapped in silence. A silence that was warmer than any fire. It was in that silence that they heard it. Borne on the wet wind, from the direction of the town, a sound both familiar and deeply ominous. The slow, heavy, tolling of a single bell. Dong, dong, dong. It wasn't the call to worship. It was the summons, the alarm, a call for every able-bodied man to gather at the courthouse. Their secret war, fought in the shadows and on the edge of a ravine, was over. Something had just made it public. The town hall was a box of trapped sound. The low ceiling pressed down on the smells of wet wool, lamp oil, and the collective, anxious breath of nearly every citizen in Brim Hollow. They packed the benches, stood along the walls, their faces pale and curious in the flickering lantern light. They were a jury of gossips and neighbors, their judgment shaped less by law than by the stories they told each other in the dark. At the front of the room, behind a heavy oak desk scarred with the initials of his predecessors, sat Judge Thaddeus Avery. He was a man whose face seemed to have been carved from weathered stone, his eyes weary from having seen the worst of human nature play out in this very room. He looked at the two figures standing before him, then at the man sitting calmly at the plaintiff's table. Luke and Eliza were a study in raw survival. Rain and mud still clung to their clothes. Luke stood unnaturally stiff, his right arm the only one that moved, his left held rigid at his side. His face was a mask of controlled agony, pale under a layer of grime. Eliza stood beside him, her dress torn, her hair a wild tangle, but her back was straight and her gaze was clear and unwavering. Opposite them, Cyrus Bell looked as if he had just stepped from a tailor's shop in the city. His cashmere coat was dry, his boots were polished, and a look of mild, civic concern was settled on his face. It was the look of a man who owned the room and everyone in it. "You called this meeting, Harrow," Judge Avery said, his voice a low rumble. "The bell tolls for fire or flood or an accusation of the highest order. This had better be the latter." Luke stepped forward. With his good hand, he reached into his coat and carefully placed the waxed canvas pouch on the judge's desk. An accusation. Judge, and the proof to back it. He unwrapped the bundle. The objects looked small and insignificant on the vast expanse of the desk. The heat-warped brass button, the piece of charred planking from his barn, and finally, the heavy, sawn-off iron latch. He then produced the receipt from his other pocket, smoothed it out, and laid it beside the rest. "This is a receipt for 5 gallons of pine oil bought by Jedediah Grimes, one of Mr. Bell's men, the day before my barn burned down," Luke said, his voice flat and hard. "This button, with the Bell Bank's insignia, was found in the ashes of an abandoned barn where the oil was stored. And this latch was sawn off the door of that same barn." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "The saw marks on this iron match the saw marks on my cabin door. Left by the men who ambushed us tonight, men who work for Cyrus Bell." A collective murmur went through the crowd. This was more than gossip. This was evidence, solid and real. Judge Avery picked up the latch, turning it over in his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked from the objects to Cyrus Bell. Bell did not look at the evidence. He looked at Luke, and a slow, condescending smile spread across his lips. He chuckled, a soft, dry sound that was more insulting than a shout. "Judge Avery, gentlemen of Brimhollow," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I appreciate Mr. Harrow's creativity. It is a sad thing to see a man so broken by misfortune that he must resort to inventing such elaborate fictions." He gestured dismissively at the items on the desk. A receipt for lamp oil, a common button, a piece of scrap iron. Is this truly what passes for evidence in this town? Or is it simply the desperate flailing of a man who cannot manage his own affairs and seeks to blame his betters for his failures? He then turned his gaze on Eliza, and his voice became laced with a cruel, insinuating sweetness. "Perhaps we should be asking about the reliability of Mr. Harrow's star witness, a woman of questionable character, a transient with no ties to this community." He let his eyes drift over the crowd, making them all complicit. "I believe the story of Mr. Harrow and his seamstress is far more compelling than this collection of junk, and certainly more believable." The shift in the room was palpable. It was as if a foul wind had blown through, extinguishing the small flame of justice and replacing it with the murky glow of slander. The whispers started again, but louder this time. The story from the pass, the rumor from the stable. The words, twisted and reshaped into something ugly, were now a weapon turned on them in public. A man in the back coughed loudly. "Inside me," he said, just loud enough for those around him to hear. A wave of snickers and muffled laughter followed. The phrase was picked up, whispered from one bench to the next, a venomous current running through the crowd. The evidence on the judge's desk was forgotten, buried under the weight of the lie. The town was closing its ranks, choosing the familiar, powerful man over the outsiders and their uncomfortable truths. Luke's face went white with a rage so profound it rendered him speechless. He took a half-step toward Bell, his good hand clenching into a fist. But Eliza put a hand on his arm, a small, restraining touch. She was the one who stepped forward. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Cyrus Bell. She addressed the judge, her voice cutting through the murmurs, as clear and sharp as one of her needles. "Judge Avery, Mr. Bell is correct about one thing. The truth should be tested." Her voice did not waver. "The saw marks on that iron latch are a fact. The marks on Mr. Harrow's cabin door are a fact. I request that you, or a carpenter of your choosing, examine both, compare them. A man's tool, like his handwriting, leaves a unique signature. If the signatures match, then you will have your truth." Her demand was so simple, so logical, it silenced the room. She had taken the argument out of the realm of rumor and placed it back in the world of physical proof. It was a challenge that could not be easily dismissed. Judge Avery looked at Eliza, a new respect dawning in his tired eyes. He looked at the sneering face of Cyrus Bell, and then back at the sawn latch. "That is a reasonable request," he declared, his voice firm. He picked up his gavel. "This hearing is suspended for 2 days. I will appoint a man to inspect the evidence. We will reconvene here, Friday at sundown." Cyrus Bell rose to his feet, his placid mask cracking for the first time to reveal the predator beneath. "2 days, Judge. This man is a flight risk. His accusations are a clear attempt to defer on his debts. I demand, as his primary creditor, that his assets be placed under the bank's temporary wardship to prevent their sale or removal. The remaining cattle, the barn, they should be impounded until this matter is settled." It was a devastating blow. Without his few remaining calves, Luke had no hope of raising the money he owed. Regardless of the hearing's outcome, Bell was ensuring his victory either way. The judge hesitated, caught between the law and the power of the bank. It was then that Eliza spoke again, her voice ringing with a new and unexpected idea. "There is no need for that, Judge." All eyes turned to her. "Mr. Harrow will not be selling his calves, but we will raise the funds to protect them." She looked out at the crowd, at the women on the benches, at the children hiding behind their mothers' skirts. "Tomorrow, at sunup, in the town square, I will hold a public mending, a mending bee, for a small donation of whatever you can spare, a coin, a bushel of corn, a few eggs. I will mend any garment brought to me." A few people chuckled. It seemed a pitiful, womanly solution to a problem of men and money and violence. But Eliza wasn't finished. She looked directly at the women. "A tear in a shirt is a small thing, but it lets the cold in. A frayed seam on a child's coat is a small thing, but it unravels. We all have things that are broken, things that need to be made whole again." Her words were simple, but they resonated with the hard, practical realities of their lives. And then, she subtly, brilliantly, began to dismantle their weapon. "I will show you how a hidden stitch, a stitch made on the inside of the seam, is what gives a garment its true strength. I will show you how a proper patch, set firmly inside the tear, can make the cloth stronger than it was before." The words hung in the air. Inside, she had taken their ugly, whispered joke and turned it into a lesson on craft, on strength, on resilience. A few of the women in the crowd exchanged glances. They understood this language. This was their world. The next morning, the town square was gray and cold. A fine drizzle was falling. At first, no one came. Then, a small boy, the son of the blacksmith, appeared, shyly holding out a pair of trousers with a ripped knee. Eliza took them with a smile, sat down on the crate she had brought, and began to work, her needle flying with a mesmerizing speed and precision. Luke was there, too. His shoulder had been crudely bandaged by the town doctor, and his arm was in a sling, but he worked with his one good hand. He had salvaged some long, smooth planks from the wreckage of his barn, and he began to assemble them into simple, sturdy benches, a place for people to sit, a man building, not destroying, slowly, tentatively. Others came, a farmer with a torn canvas sack, a mother with 3 children, all with frayed cuffs and worn-out elbows. People began to gather, not with the malicious curiosity of the night before, but with a quiet, genuine interest. They brought not just clothes, but small donations, a sack of potatoes, a jar of preserves, a pile of scrap lumber for Luke. A woman brought a box of old fabric, another a collection of spare buttons. Eliza worked, and as she worked, she talked. She showed them how to reinforce a seam from within. She demonstrated how to set a bolt on the inside of a frame to make a door strong. She took the words that had been used to shame her, and she redefined them, stitch by stitch, in front of the whole town. This, her actions said, is what it means to work on the inside. It is not a secret, shameful act. It is the source of all hidden strength. The crowd watched her hands, their eyes following the dance of the needle. They saw the skill, the honesty, the undeniable competence. They saw a woman making broken things whole. And for the first time, in the cold light of day, the whispers of Brim Hollow began to change, the ugly rumor fading, replaced by a quiet, growing respect. The night air was cold and damp, carrying the clean scent of rain-washed dust. A procession of lanterns moved like a line of captured stars from the town hall to the edge of Luke's property, their bobbing lights casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar trees into stooped, watchful figures. It was not a mob. The mending bee had seen to that. This was a jury, sober and silent, walking to the scene of the crime. Judge Avery led the way, his face grim in the yellow light. Reverend Miller walked beside him, his Bible held tight in his hand, a man prepared to witness either justice or damnation. The town carpenter, an old man named Silas Croft, whose hands were as gnarled as the wood he worked, followed close behind. And behind them, the townspeople, their faces a collection of guarded curiosity, their earlier mockery replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Cyrus Bell and his men were there, too, forced to attend by the judge's unassailable command. Bell maintained an air of bored indignation, as if the entire affair were a distasteful but necessary bit of theater. His men, including the hulking Jedediah Grimes, shifted their weight from foot to foot, their eyes darting nervously into the darkness beyond the lantern light. They gathered before the cabin door. It stood as a testament to the storm, scarred and braced, a symbol of a battle won. Luke stood beside it, his left arm in its sling a stark reminder of the cost. Eliza was on his other side, a single lantern in her hand. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the door. Judge Avery, she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily in the still night air. This is where they tried to break in. She raised the lantern, the light falling on the deep, ragged grooves chewed into the doorframe. These are the marks left by their saw. The crowd pressed closer to see. The marks were ugly, a violent scar on the otherwise solid wood. And this, Luke said, his voice a low rumble, is the latch from the abandoned barn. He held up the heavy, sawn-off piece of iron. Judge Avery took it, his expression unreadable. He held it next to the marks on the doorframe, to the untrained eye. They were just cuts, but the implication was clear. Silas, the judge said, turning to the old carpenter. Silas Croft stepped forward, running a thumb, as worn and smooth as a river stone, over the cuts in the doorframe. He then took the iron latch from the judge, examining the sawn face with an expert's eye, tilting it in the lantern light. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he could feel the bite of the blade in his memory. "It's the same tool," he said, his voice raspy with age but firm with certainty. "A crosscut saw with a wide set, and see here." He pointed with a cracked fingernail to a tiny, repeating imperfection in the grooves. "There's a chipped tooth. Leaves a deeper score every third pass. Same on the door, same on the iron." He handed the latch back to the judge. "Ain't but one crew round here uses a blade set that wide, and a dull one at that. Too lazy to sharpen their tools proper." "And which crew would that be?" the judge asked, his eyes fixed on the old man. "The one Bell hired to clear timber out at his oil derrick," Silas said, without a flicker of hesitation. He looked directly at Cyrus Bell. "I sold them the blade myself, 6 months back." A heavy silence fell over the gathering. The first solid link had been forged. Cyrus Bell's condescending smile tightened at the edges. An old man's fantasy. He probably can't tell one saw from another anymore. Before the judge could respond, a small voice piped up from the edge of the crowd. "I found something. Two The town blacksmith pushed his young son, Tim, gently forward. The boy was no more than 10, his face pale with a mixture of fear and resolve. In his small, grubby hand, he held out a small object. It was the burnt brass button Eliza had found. "I was with my pa," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as he spoke. "We were looking for scrap metal out by the old abandoned barn, the day after the storm. I found this in the dirt, where the oil stain was." Judge Avery knelt down, bringing his lantern and his gaze level with the boy's. "And what is it, son?" "It's a button," Tim said. He held it out. In the combined light of the lanterns, everyone could now see the raised, stylized letter B on its surface, warped by heat but still unmistakable. "It's like the one on the uniform Mr. Grimes wears when he's loading the wagon at the bank." Every head turned toward Jedediah Grimes. The big man flinched as if he'd been struck. He instinctively glanced down at his own coat, a plain woolen thing now, but the ghost of the button was there for all to see. He had worn the bank's livery coat that night. Cyrus Bell finally lost his composure. He took a step forward, his voice sharp with fury. "This is a circus, an absolute farce. You're basing an accusation on the word of a senile carpenter and a grubby child playing in the dirt. This is an insult to the law." "The law, Mr. Bell," Judge Avery said, rising to his full height, his voice like the grinding of stones, "is about the truth, and the truth seems to be building a rather sturdy case." Bell opened his mouth to retort, but he never got the chance. The pressure had become too much. The chain of evidence, the receipt, the saw, the button was tightening around one man in particular, Jedediah Grimes, his face ashen with sweat in the cool night air. Finally broke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he blurted out, the words tumbling from his lips in a desperate, panicked rush. His eyes were wide, darting from the judge to Bell to the silent, accusing faces of the crowd. "He paid us, mister. Bell paid us. Be silent, you fool." Bell hissed, his face a mask of cold fury. But the dam had burst. He just wanted to scare him, Grimes cried, his voice cracking, to rough up the place a bit, make him think the land was cursed, that he should sell cheap, the fire. Sam Harrow. "That was an accident. The lamp just tipped over. It wasn't supposed to burn. We just wanted to scare the horses, make a little trouble." He pointed a trembling finger at Bell. It was his idea. All of it. The fire, the ambush at the creek, all of it just for a piece of dirt. The confession, raw and pathetic, hung in the night air, more damning than any piece of physical evidence. The townspeople stared. Their suspicions hardened into a terrible certainty. This wasn't a feud between two men. This was a crime against one of their own. A boy they had all known. A family that had been part of this land for generations. A profound, deathly silence descended upon the group. In that silence, the wind picked up, a low moan through the pine trees. It was a different wind now. It wasn't the wind of rumor and suspicion. It was a cold wind of truth, and on it, from the direction of the abandoned barn, carried on the damp air, came a faint, ghostly smell. The acrid, unmistakable scent of old pine oil. It was the smell of guilt, and it was undeniable. Judge Avery looked at Cyrus Bell, and for the first time, Bell had no answer. The power he held, the power of money and influence, had vanished, stripped away by a carpenter's eye, a child's honesty, and a coward's confession. The judge turned and walked back toward the town, the crowd parting before him. He stopped at his horse, pulled a document from his saddlebag, and signed it using the flat of the saddle as his desk. He handed it to the town's part-time sheriff. "The Bell Bank's foreclosure proceedings against the Harrow property are suspended, indefinitely," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "A full investigation into the fire that caused the death of Samuel Harrow is hereby opened. Mr. Grimes and his associates are to be held in custody, and I am issuing a warrant to impound the Bell warehouse and all its contents, pending a full audit." He had not declared Bell guilty, but he had taken away all his weapons. The legal battle was far from over, but the war for Brim Hollow's soul had just seen its tide turn. As the crowd began to disperse, leading the shackled, sobbing Grimes and his stunned accomplices back to the town jail. Eliza and Luke remained by the cabin door. The lanterns were moving away, leaving them in the growing dark. The night was quiet again. Eliza looked from the scarred door frame to the place on Luke's shoulder where the splinter had been. She thought of the ripped seams she had mended, the broken parts she had made strong again. "I believe," she said softly, her voice just for him. "The inside of us just got a stitch put in it." Luke looked down at her. The hard lines of his face softened in the darkness. He then looked at his own right hand, the one that had held the evidence, the one that had fought to save them. It was a hand crisscrossed with scars from ropes and tools and splinters. For years, he had seen them as marks of failure. Failure to save his brother. Failure to hold his ranch together. But tonight, standing beside this woman who saw the hidden strength in things, he saw them differently. They weren't marks of what he had lost. They were proof of what he had endured. For the first time in a very long time, they were not a source of shame. They were a map of his survival. The weeks that followed the night of the lanterns were quiet. The town of Brim Hollow seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for a year. The silence was different now. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a peaceful quiet, the sound of a community mending itself. Cyrus Bell, stripped of his henchmen and facing a federal inquiry, was a diminished figure. To pay his mounting legal fees and the fines levied by the court, he was forced to sell off parcels of land. The stranglehold he'd had on the town was broken. People walked a little taller, their conversations in the general store a little louder, their laughter a little easier. The land itself seemed to exhale. The spring rains came, not as a furious deluge, but as a soft, steady shower that settled the dust and turned the hills a shade of green so vibrant it hurt the eyes. At Cedar Wash, the small herd of calves Luke had protected with such grim determination thrived, their coats slick and healthy. The Harrow curse, the legacy of blood and fire his father had spoken of, was revealed to be nothing more than a ghost story, a lie crafted by a greedy man. The only debt the land had ever demanded was hard work and honest sweat. In the midst of this quiet healing, the mail rider brought a letter for Eliza. It bore the postmark of Santa Vita, a prosperous city to the south, known for its fine dressmakers and wealthy clientele. The envelope was thick, the handwriting on it elegant and assured. It was from a Madame Evangeline, a name Eliza recognized with a jolt. She was one of the most respected couturiers in the territory. She read the letter standing in the doorway of her stable, the scent of cedar and clean rain in the air. The offer was everything she had once dreamed of, a position as senior seamstress in an established workshop, a salary that was more than she had made in the last year combined. The letter spoke of security, of working with fine silks and French lace, of a room of her own in a boarding house with a sturdy tile roof that would never leak. Santa Vita. It was the opposite of Brim Hollow. It was a place of order, of predictability, of safety. It was a world away from makeshift repairs in dusty stables, from storms that tried to tear the world apart, from men with haunted eyes and wounds that were more than skin deep. She held the letter in her hand, the crisp paper a tangible promise of a life where she would never have to be afraid again. Luke found her there, staring at the letter as if it were a map to a foreign country. He didn't ask what it was. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the complex mixture of hope and sorrow in her eyes. He had just finished turning a patch of soil near the cabin, preparing it for a small vegetable garden, and his hands were dark with the rich, damp earth. He stood there for a long moment, the comfortable silence that had grown between them now feeling fragile. He looked from her face to the old, ramshackle stable she had transformed into a place of purpose. Then he looked toward the blackened timbers of his ruined barn. "Don't go," he said. The words were simple, stripped of any artifice. "It's a good offer." "Luke," she said, her voice quiet. "A real roof, a steady wage. I know." He took a step closer. "I can't offer you that. Not yet, but I can offer this." He gestured with his head, not toward the cabin, but toward the old livery stable. "We could build it, a proper workshop, right here." He looked back at her. his gray eyes serious, his idea taking shape as he spoke. "We could put your sewing table there, by the big window, for the morning light. We could build shelves for your fabric. A proper cutting table." He paused, and then added the part that was entirely his own. "And on that far wall, we could build bookshelves, floor to ceiling. Fill them with books, for the children in town who have none, for anyone who wants to learn." He looked at her, his vision clear and bright in his mind. "We could call it the Cedar Wash Library and Stitchery, a place for mending things, clothes and other things." He took a breath. "We'd be partners. We'd split everything, right down the middle. Every dollar, every decision." Eliza stared at him, her heart a confusion of turmoil and a strange, soaring hope. A partnership. A library. He wasn't just offering her a place to work. He was offering her a place to build. He had seen not just her skill, but her soul. And yet, fear, that old, familiar traveling companion, whispered to her. She had been on her own for so long, defined only by her own labor, her own resilience, to tie her life to his, to this land, felt like a terrifying risk. What if she disappeared into his story? What if she became just a shadow, the rancher's woman, her own name and purpose lost in the vastness of his sky? His property, I don't know if I can. "Luke," she whispered, the words tasting of doubt. "I've always been my own. I'm afraid I'd be secondary here, an addition to your life." Luke listened, his expression unchanging. He didn't argue. He didn't try to persuade her with more words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy, ornate iron key. It was old and slightly rusted. It was the key to his father's storeroom, the one place in the cabin that held the few heirlooms the Harrow family possessed: old ledgers, his mother's china, his brother's childhood toys. It was the key to his past. He held it out to her, laying it flat on his earth-stained palm. "This is the key to the storeroom," he said, his voice low and steady. "I am the only one who has ever held it. Now you will, too." He looked directly into her eyes, and the truth of his promise was absolute. "We hold it together. Eliza, we open it together. There is no shadow here, only level ground." She looked from the key to his face, and in that moment, the choice became clear. Santa Vita was a shelter. This was a home. Slowly, she reached out and took the key. Its cold, solid weight in her hand was the most reassuring thing she had ever felt. The work of building was slow and joyful. They swept the stable clean of its ghosts, the dust of a decade, until the air smelled only of cedar and sunshine. Luke, with his one good arm, planed and sanded the salvaged wood, his movements patient and precise. He built her a long, sturdy cutting table and placed it under the main window, just as he had promised. He built the bookshelves on the far wall, the raw, pale wood beautiful against the old, dark timbers of the stable. Eliza organized her world within that space, her spools of thread arranged like a rainbow, her bolts of cloth stacked in neat, colorful piles. She found an old armchair at the general store, patched its worn upholstery, and placed it in the corner by the new shelves. The first chair for the first library in Brim Hollow. One morning, as Eliza was writing a letter, her hand moved across the page with a newfound certainty, the slight tremor that had been her constant companion since the chase. The tremor of held-in fear was gone. Her eyes, however, were bright. She was refusing the offer from Madame Evangeline, her words polite but firm. She had found her place. That evening, they sat on the porch of the cabin, a comfortable silence between them. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new grass. Luke had been watching her, a look in his eyes she had not seen before, a quiet, wondering tenderness that made her breath catch. He leaned toward her, his intention clear. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a question being asked without words. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the storms they had weathered, all the truths they had shared. This was the moment, the culmination. But just as his lips were about to touch hers, Eliza lifted her hand and gently, so gently, laid her fingers against his forehead. It was an impossibly intimate gesture, a touch that spoke not of passion, but of a deep and profound understanding. He stopped, his eyes questioning hers. "When you are standing strong on the inside," she whispered, her voice as soft as the coming dusk, "only then can your lips speak the truth. A kiss now," she was telling him, "would be born of relief, of gratitude, of the shared trauma of survival. It would be a beautiful thing, but not yet a whole thing. A true kiss, the kind that sealed a life, had to come from a place of peace, from two people who had mended themselves completely, from the inside out." Luke searched her eyes and understood. He leaned back, not in rejection, but in acceptance. He took her hand from his forehead, held it in his own, and just sat with her, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. It was not an ending. It was a promise that the day would come when they were both whole enough for the truest words of all. The weeks that followed the night of the lanterns were quiet. The town of Brim Hollow seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for a year. The silence was different now. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a peaceful quiet, the sound of a community mending itself. Cyrus Bell, stripped of his henchmen and facing a federal inquiry, was a diminished figure. To pay his mounting legal fees and the fines levied by the court, he was forced to sell off parcels of land. The stranglehold he'd had on the town was broken. People walked a little taller, their conversations in the general store a little louder, their laughter a little easier. The land itself seemed to exhale. The spring rains came, not as a furious deluge, but as a soft, steady shower that settled the dust and turned the hills a shade of green so vibrant it hurt the eyes. At Cedar Wash, the small herd of calves Luke had protected with such grim determination thrived, their coats slick and healthy. The Harrow curse, the legacy of blood and fire his father had spoken of, was revealed to be nothing more than a ghost story, a lie crafted by a greedy man. The only debt the land had ever demanded was hard work and honest sweat. In the midst of this quiet healing, the mail rider brought a letter for Eliza. It bore the postmark of Santa Vida, a prosperous city to the south, known for its fine dressmakers and wealthy clientele. The envelope was thick, the handwriting on it elegant and assured. It was from a Madame Evangeline, a name Eliza recognized with a jolt. She was one of the most respected couturiers in the territory. She read the letter standing in the doorway of her stable, the scent of cedar and clean rain in the air. The offer was everything she had once dreamed of. A position as senior seamstress in an established workshop, a salary that was more than she had made in the last year combined. The letter spoke of security, of working with fine silks and French lace, of a room of her own in a boarding house with a sturdy tile roof that would never leak. Santa Vida. It was the opposite of Brim Hollow. It was a place of order, of predictability, of safety. It was a world away from makeshift repairs and dusty stables, from storms that tried to tear the world apart, from men with haunted eyes and wounds that were more than skin deep. She held the letter in her hand, the crisp paper a tangible promise of a life where she would never have to be afraid again. Luke found her there, staring at the letter as if it were a map to a foreign country. He didn't ask what it was. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the complex mixture of hope and sorrow in her eyes. He had just finished turning a patch of soil near the cabin, preparing it for a small vegetable garden, and his hands were dark with the rich, damp earth. He stood there for a long moment, the comfortable silence that had grown between them now feeling fragile. He looked from her face to the old, ramshackle stable she had transformed into a place of purpose. Then he looked toward the blackened timbers of his ruined barn. "Don't go," he said. The words were simple, stripped of any artifice. "It's a good offer, Luke," she said, her voice quiet. "A real roof, a steady wage." "I know." He took a step closer. "I can't offer you that, not yet, but I can offer this." He gestured with his head, not toward the cabin, but toward the old livery stable. "We could build it, A proper workshop. Right here. He looked back at her, his gray eyes serious, his idea taking shape as he spoke. We could put your sewing table there, by the big window, for the morning light. We could build shelves for your fabric, a proper cutting table. He paused, and then added the part that was entirely his own. And on that far wall, we could build bookshelves, floor to ceiling, fill them with books, for the children in town who have none, for anyone who wants to learn. He looked at her, his vision clear and bright in his mind. We could call it the Cedar Wash Library and Stitchery, a place for mending things, clothes and other things. He took a breath. We'd be partners. We'd split everything, right down the middle, every dollar, every decision. Eliza stared at him, her heart a confusion of turmoil and a strange, soaring hope. A partnership. A library. He wasn't just offering her a place to work. He was offering her a place to build. He had seen not just her skill, but her soul. And yet, fear, that old, familiar traveling companion, whispered to her. She had been on her own for so long, defined only by her own labor, her own resilience. To tie her life to his, to this land, felt like a terrifying risk. What if she disappeared into his story? What if she became just a shadow, the rancher's woman, her own name and purpose lost in the vastness of his sky? His property, I don't know if I can. Luke, she whispered, the words tasting of doubt. I've always been my own. I'm afraid I'd be secondary here, an addition to your life. Luke listened, his expression unchanging. He didn't argue. He didn't try to persuade her with more words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy, ornate iron key. It was old and slightly rusted. It was the key to his father's storeroom, the one place in the cabin that held the few heirlooms the Harrow family possessed: old ledgers, his mother's china, his brother's childhood toys. It was the key to his past. He held it out to her, laying it flat on his earth-stained palm. "This is the key to the storeroom," he said, his voice low and steady. "I am the only one who has ever held it. Now you will too." He looked directly into her eyes, and the truth of his promise was absolute. "We hold it together, Eliza. We open it together. There is no shadow here, only level ground." She looked from the key to his face, and in that moment, the choice became clear. Santa Vida was a shelter. This was a home. Slowly, she reached out and took the key. Its cold, solid weight in her hand was the most reassuring thing she had ever felt. The work of building was slow and joyful. They swept the stable clean of its ghosts, the dust of a decade, until the air smelled only of cedar and sunshine. Luke, with his one good arm, planed and sanded the salvaged wood, his movements patient and precise. He built her a long, sturdy cutting table and placed it under the main window, just as he had promised. He built the bookshelves on the far wall, the raw, pale wood beautiful against the old, dark timbers of the stable. Eliza organized her world within that space, her spools of thread arranged like a rainbow, her bolts of cloth stacked in neat, colorful piles. She found an old armchair at the general store, patched its worn upholstery, and placed it in the corner by the new shelves. The first chair for the first library in Brim Hollow. One morning, as Eliza was writing a letter, her hand moved across the page with a newfound certainty. The slight tremor that had been her constant companion since the chase, the tremor of held-in fear, was gone. Her eyes, however, were bright. She was refusing the offer from Madame Evangeline, her words polite but firm. She had found her place. That evening, they sat on the porch of the cabin, a comfortable silence between them. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new grass. Luke had been watching her, a look in his eyes she had not seen before, a quiet, wondering tenderness that made her breath catch. He leaned toward her, his intention clear. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a question being asked without words. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the storms they had weathered, all the truths they had shared. This was the moment, the culmination. But just as his lips were about to touch hers, Eliza lifted her hand and gently, so gently, laid her fingers against his forehead. It was an impossibly intimate gesture, a touch that spoke not of passion, but of a deep and profound understanding. He stopped, his eyes questioning hers. "When you are standing strong on the inside," she whispered, her voice as soft as the coming dusk, "only then can your lips speak the truth. A kiss now," she was telling him, "would be born of relief, of gratitude, of the shared trauma of survival. It would be a beautiful thing, but not yet a whole thing, a true kiss, the kind that sealed a life, had to come from a place of peace, from two people who had mended themselves completely, from the inside out." Luke searched her eyes and understood. He leaned back, not in rejection, but in acceptance. He took her hand from his forehead, held it in his own, and just sat with her, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. It was not an ending. It was a promise that the day would come when they were both whole enough for the truest words of all. The hum of the sewing machine was the steady heartbeat of the new season. It had become a familiar sound in Brim Hollow, as regular as the blacksmith's hammer and the church bell on Sunday. Then, with a final, soft thump, the needle stopped. The last stitch was set. Eliza Hart snipped the thread, her movements economical and graceful. She folded the small garment a boy's shirt, made from sturdy, blue-dyed cotton. It seems reinforced with the hidden strength she had promised. Young Tim, the blacksmith's son, stood before her, his eyes wide with a quiet awe. His old shirt was a thing of patches and frayed edges. This new one was a piece of art, made just for him. He was one of several orphans and children from the poorest families for whom Eliza now stitched, her payment taken from the small but steady profits of the mending business. She handed him the shirt. It was still warm from the press of the iron. "There you are, Tim," she said, her smile gentle. "Strong enough for any adventure you can find." He took it with a reverence usually reserved for Sunday school, clutching it to his chest. He didn't have a coin to his name, but he paid her with a gap-toothed grin that was worth more than gold. As he ran out of the workshop, shirt held high like a banner, Luke entered, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe. In his good hand, he carried a long, freshly carved plank of cedar. The wood was pale and beautiful, and the air filled with its clean, sharp scent. Carved into its surface in deep, simple block letters were the words he had worked on for a week, his knife strokes slow and deliberate. "Cedar Wash Library Stitchery." He didn't say a word, just held it up for her to see. She ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the smooth, confident cuts. It was more than a sign. It was a testament. It was their two lives, their two skills, carved into a single piece of wood, made to last. Together, they hung it over the wide stable doors. They hammered the nails in unison, his heavy blows and her lighter, guiding taps creating a syncopated rhythm. When it was done, they stepped back into the dusty yard and looked up. The sign was straight and true. It looked as if it had always been there. The afternoon sun warmed their faces, and, in the comfortable silence, Eliza knew the moment had come. She reached into her pocket and took out the small, folded square of white cotton. It was Luke's handkerchief, the one he had dropped by the well, the one he had pressed into her hands during the sandstorm. It was clean now, washed in rainwater and dried in the sun. The thin, worn spot in the center had been mended with a nearly invisible pattern of stitches, the patch making it stronger than the original fabric. And in one corner, in a tiny, perfect script of dark blue silk thread, she had embroidered a single word, "Inside." She held it out to him. "I believe this is yours," she said softly. He took it. He unfolded the cloth, and his gaze fell on the embroidered word. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb gently stroking the raised stitches. He understood everything she had poured into that single word, the memory of her desperate cries in the storm, her instructions for mending the machine, her explanation of how to build something strong, her confession of a broken past. It was their entire story, stitched into a scrap of cloth. He folded it carefully, not with the brisk efficiency of a rancher, but with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. He didn't put it in his back pocket. He unbuttoned the front of his shirt and tucked the handkerchief into the small inner pocket of his vest, the one that rested directly over his heart. And then he smiled. It was not the grim, tight-lipped expression he usually wore. It was a true smile, a rare and beautiful thing that reached his gray eyes and transformed his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows, as if on cue, from the town below. The church bell began to chime, not with the urgency of an alarm, but with the slow, peaceful cadence of the evening call. The day was ending. A gentle breeze drifted up from the valley, carrying with it the sense of a world made new, the smell of freshly cut grass, the sharp perfume of pine resin from the woods, and from the workshop behind them, the clean, honest smell of new fabric and cedar wood. They stood there for a moment longer, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Eliza looked up at his face, at the smile that was just for her, and she felt a final seam settle into place within her own heart. The last of the fear, the last of the doubt, was gone. She was whole, inside me, she asked, her voice a near whisper, the words now reclaimed, remade into something beautiful. Is it whole enough now? She wasn't talking about the door, or the cabin, or the mending. She was asking about herself, about the heart she had so carefully stitched back together. Luke's smile softened. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her jaw. His touch was warm and sure. He looked into her eyes, and his answer was not just a reply. It was a vow. It's whole enough, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, to let you inside every morning. He leaned down and kissed her. It happened there, under the scarred door of the cabin they had defended together, the wood still bearing the marks of their struggle. The kiss was not frantic or desperate, like their fight against the storm. It was quiet, deep, and sure. A kiss that tasted of dust and rain and the promise of 1,000 sunrises. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was the feeling of a final, perfect stitch locking into place. Inside. The cabin was warm and dark. Outside, the sky was clear and filled with the first stars. From the pasture, one of the cows let out a low, contented bellow. From the town, they could hear the faint, distant laughter of children playing their last game before being called in for supper. The whispering heart of Brim Hollow was finally still, its people too busy with the work of living to trade in rumors. The heavy cabin door, which had once been a barricade against a hostile world, was now a threshold. It stood ready to be closed tight against the wind and the night, but it would open wide for two people ready to step inside a new life, together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our tale, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.